Okay. So I will
Okay.
go ahead and share my screen again. So please just
Yeah.
confirm that you can see the full slides.
Yeah, we can see it.
Right.
So
Okay.
let me just introduce you. So we have Julie de Jong and de Jong, sorry, and colleagues today presenting some of their work on response styles, on subjective socioeconomic status and comparative research. So this is our last WISM talk for this semester. So we're excited to have you guys here presenting today. We'll have about 30 minutes for presentation, 30 minutes for Q&A. And if participants or people attending wouldn't mind, turning on their cameras so we're not just speaking into the void, that would be great. Feel free to post your questions in the chat, or just raise your hand during the Q&A, and we can answer in the order received. So, Julie, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Luke, and thank you, Noam, for the invitation. We really appreciate it. So I'm Julie de Jong. I'm here today from the Survey Research Center at the University of Michigan, and I'm joined by several of my colleagues. Fred Conrad is also in the Survey Research Center. Junhui Qian and Chuzhu Zhong are both in the Survey Research Center as first-year master's students in survey methodology. And then Caitlin Hayward is actually in the Center for Academic Innovations at U of M. And they're responsible for developing and promoting a number of online resources that I'll talk about in a little bit here. So we're excited to share this preliminary research with everyone. And I'll just want to note that this is a topic that's somewhat new to all of us. So again, we really appreciate your feedback. This is the first time we're presenting about it and talking about it. We've been working on it for the last 2 semesters, but we're happy to take any and all feedback that you might have for us this morning. And so I'd like to start with an introduction to multinational, multi-regional, multicultural, what we call 3MC research, given that the focus of today's talk is really on methods and error in comparative studies, although we're very narrowly focused on a specific topic, which I'll get to in a few minutes. So, the goal of surveys in 3MC context is really comparability. And this is where instruments and other aspects of the study design are deliberately designed to compare findings. And ideally, data are valid and reliable both for a given cultural context or national context and are comparable across these contexts. 3MC surveys go beyond the same survey conducted among multiple populations or countries, in that the goal is to produce data that are valid and reliable, again, both for these specific contexts as well as to be comparable. And as many of us know, however, especially I know some of you who do work on comparative surveys, this isn't always straightforward, and there can be a tension between optimizing quality and precision in particular in a single population or context and optimizing comparability across those contexts at the same time. Excuse me, and forgive me, I'm just recovering from a cold. So there's ample evidence that 3MC surveys are growing in number, geographic spread, and topic coverage. Surveys generate rich cross-national data and official statistics on key public domains, including in areas of education, labor, economic indicators, public opinion, public health, and well-being. And these are used by many different types of stakeholders, including government agencies, academics, nonprofits, and industries. And so this table on the slide just provides a brief overview for those of you who are not as familiar with comparative research on both the different numbers of disciplines within academia that are often involved in comparative research, as well as the numerous examples of both global and regional 3MC surveys. I'll note that this is not exhaustive. We know we're not aware of all surveys that are out there, but we have developed this table over the years to keep track of just, to really provide the scope of comparative surveys as we see it. And of course, survey research doesn't happen in a vacuum, and that's particularly true in 3MC surveys, both regionally and especially globally, where we're subject to challenges in comparability, resulting not only from potential operational differences in survey design and administration, but also really from these cultural differences, many of which in many ways are harder to identify and to quantify. And thus, given the scope and importance of 3MC studies for global leadership, it's also equally critical that we understand the role that culture plays in survey research and the quality of survey data. So there's many ways to conceptualize culture, and I see our colleague Tim Johnson in the audience today. And Tim recently gave a really wonderful talk at U of M last month on the intersection of cross-cultural survey research and cross-cultural psychology. And at that time, he identified a number of relevant cultural frameworks that I just want to cover very, very briefly before I start getting into our analyses. One of the most widely recognized names on this list likely is Geert Hofstede, who's known for his work on how values influence culture and ultimately describes cultures along 6 different dimensions or cultural orientations. Shalom Schwartz has a theory of universal values where he identifies 10 broad personal values, which are differentiated by the underlying goals or motivations of people. Ron Engelhardt and Christian Wetzel argue that there's 2 major dimensions of national values and cross-cultural variation in the world, traditional values versus secular rational values, and survival values versus self-expression values. Franz Trompenaars and Charles Hamden Turner identified 7 other value dimensions of cultures and beliefs. Harry Triandis discusses the concept of tight cultures, where there's many rules, norms, and standards for correct behavior, as compared to loose cultures where there are far fewer such norms. And then Miguel Batinier identified 3 clusters of culture in the world: honor, achievement, and joy. And he argued how these cultures are associated with the speed at which social, cultural, and economic change occurs in societies. So again, this list isn't at all exhaustive. Other scholars such as Michael Minkoff have identified variations and additions to some of these frameworks, and certainly there's overlap, which I'll note in just a moment. But these numerous cultural frameworks give us ample opportunities to consider all the ways in which respondents might complete our surveys and how they might be influenced by the different cultures in which they were raised, in which they live. So like I said, there may well be some replication across these various culture dimensions as well. In a very recent paper, Annelies Kassa at the University of Tartu in Estonia merged several of these frameworks, of these paradigms. She looked at Hofstede, Schwartz, and Engelhardt, and she merged them into one system based on the assumptions that dimensions from these different sets overlap. And given this myriad of potential culture differences and overlaps, then what ramifications might there be for survey researchers? Are there impacts of data quality? Are people in a society where one dimension of culture is more predominant than another more likely to be vulnerable to certain types of survey error? So, focusing on that question, Tim Johnson and Henning Silber in the last few years have considered these 3 same cultural frameworks, Hofstede, Schwartz, and Engelhardt. And they really specifically focus on how differences in culture may impact data quality through responses to substantive variables of interest. And so, several methodologies have been looking at this over the last decade or so, and a couple of decades. And so Tim and Henning specifically looked for evidence in the literature where these cultural dimensions of Hofstede, Schwartz, and Engelhardt were used to explain survey error resulting from extreme response styles, acquiescence, socially desirable reporting, all of which are on the measurement side of total survey error framework, and then item non-response and unit item non-response on the non-response side of TSE. And so with the author's caveat that their literature review wasn't fully systematic and may have missed relevant publications, they found the most evidence in literature to support the association between survey error, these different dimensions of survey error, and actually Hofstede's framework, with a total of 45 publications identified across the various error sources. And while I don't show it here, they also looked for Schwartz and Engelhardt, and they only identified 4 publications for Schwartz associated with measurement or non-response error, and found no publications at all for Engelhardt. And so in our preliminary analysis that we're sharing today, we're actually narrowing in on one of these types of error that's most commonly reported, which is extreme response style. And I'll talk more about exactly what that is for those of you who might not be familiar with it in just a minute. But as I mentioned earlier, going in on extreme response style and Hofstede, as I mentioned earlier, Hofstede identified 6 different cultural dimensions. These are individual collectivism, uncertainty avoidance, masculinity, femininity, power distance, time orientation, and indulgence versus restraint. And if we look specifically at the set of publications that Tim identified that looked at Hofstede's cultural dimensions vis-a-vis extreme response style, we see he identified the greatest number of publications specifically linking extreme response style with Hofstede's individual collectivism framework. Okay, so it's really at this very specific juncture, extreme response style and individual collectivism, where we're focusing these preliminary analyses that I'm talking about today. Although, as I talk about later, this is something we want to continue to advance and look at some of these other frameworks as well. But today we're really just narrowly focused on this specific intersection. So I just want to cover the definitions of these two components before proceeding. So first, what is extreme response style, or as I might call it in shorthand later this morning, ERS. So for those of you who might not be familiar with this type of bias, extreme response refers to the propensity for respondents to systematically choose endpoints of response scales, regardless of the question content. So it can refer to both the propensity to negatively as well as positively select endpoints of any given rating scale. So in this example question where respondents are asked about levels of happiness, you can see how responses are clustered at both ends. And the issue, of course, is that these may actually be valid responses, right? But the distribution may also be indicative of some sort of bias propensity among respondents to use an extreme response style. Next, let's just be on the same page about what Hofstede's dimensions of individualism and collectivism are. So the cultural dimension of individualism is predominant in an individualistic society in which the ties between individuals are loose and where everyone's expected to look after his or her immediate family only. And this is in contrast with the cultural dimension of collectivism, which is predominant in collectivist societies. And that's where people from birth onwards are integrated into a strong, cohesive in-group, which throughout people's lifetime continue to protect them in exchange for unquestioning loyalty. And of course, these are generalizations for sure. But Hofstede used these ideas to create an individual collectivism index based on responses initially to 14 different work-life goals, where he computed a score for different countries based on survey data from that country itself. And over time, over the last several decades, these measures have been updated since Hofstede's first publications. And I'm not going to go into this any further, but I have included a few citations if you're interested in further details. So I'm sure this looks familiar to many of you. It's a representation of collectivism and individualism on a world map, where the index is from 0 to 100, and where the lower end of the scale indicates societies that are more collectivist, and the higher end indicates societies that are more individualistic. Excuse me. And as an anchor, I'll just mention that Guatemala and Ecuador are among the countries where their scores are the lowest. And for example, these have scores of 6 and 8 respectively, where at the other end of the extreme, the US has the highest score with its most recent score pegged at 91. And so the 10 studies that Tim Johnson identified in one of my previous slides, where we looked really at this juncture between the collectivist individualistic framework and extreme response style, are varied, but they generally focus on comparisons between a relatively small number of countries or cultural contexts, although one study does use data from as many as 26 countries. And generally, these studies found evidence indicating that respondents from more individualistic societies, where competition is emphasized, are more likely to use extreme response, ERS, while those from collectivist societies, where connectivity and moderation are emphasized, tend to use more middle categories, that is less ERS. And presumably, again, very generally, it's generally thought that, people from individualistic societies are more comfortable with identifying and being at the extreme end of the scale, standing out. Well, again, speaking very generally, people from collectivist societies are more likely to gravitate toward the middle rather than stand out at either end. Oops, sorry. Here we go. So now that we've covered some theoretical background, let's turn to a few details about the survey from which our data from today's talk comes. So our work really began last year when Kate Hayward reached out to us for her home at the Center for Academic Innovations at U of M, with an extensive data set that she had access to, resulting from a survey that they embed at the start of over 200 U of M massive open online courses, or otherwise known as MOOCs, that they host on Coursera, edX, and FutureLearn. And so all attendees to these MOOCs are invited to complete a pre-course online survey. It takes about 8 to 10 minutes to complete. And in general, at any given time, between 5 to 10% of MOOC learners complete the pre-survey. They launched this survey in 2016 and they overhauled it in 2020. And the data that I'm going to be talking about today come from the range of September 2020 to September 2021. So keeping in mind, this is still during the pandemic, where they really had an uptake in learners. And the data that we're talking about from this 1 year time frame represents about 400,000 people. Excuse me. So it's really a very massive data set, which is why it was so appealing to us. And so again, during this time frame, we have data from about 240 countries and overseas territories. Although, this of course is very differentially distributed across countries and territories. I can say that about 170 countries had at least 20 respondents, 131 had at least 100 respondents, and most of the remainder had at least several hundred, with about 60 countries having at least 1,000 respondents each. And I'll show you the distributions in just a moment, but it is quite unevenly distributed across the world. So the size of the data set's both really attractive and that small effects are more likely to be detectable, but it is also challenging in that these small effects, which may not be theoretically important, may also be significant in distracting the models just because our sample is so overpowered. However, the data set did also provide us an opportunity to extend some of the methods research on extreme response style and cultural frameworks that we've been wanting to do. And I'm from the International Unit of the Survey Research Center and work with a number of people who do cross-cultural research methodology. And it often can be difficult to find data sets that are really appropriate to study some of these larger questions. And so, we were really excited to be able to use such a large sample from around the world. And so, like I mentioned before, our work here that I'm going to start talking about is really preliminary. And so, we are happy for any comments that you are going to have in the discussion section. And if you would excuse me for just a minute, I would like to just mute myself for just a second so I can cough. I'm so sorry. I've been really struggling this past week. Thanks. Okay, so going on. So at this stage of our analyses, we're really using these data to focus on an important variable whose vulnerability to error, to the best of our knowledge, hasn't really been investigated through a cultural lens. And that's the variable known in the literature as subjective social status, SSS for short, where respondents are asked to rate themselves relative to others. And I need to be clear here that SSS has definitely been investigated in a comparative context, but not specifically in how cultural frameworks might differentially impact survey error. That's, survey error ends up really being investigated rather narrowly by, survey methodologists. And we're excited to be able to look at this through this very specific lens of survey error and cultural dimensions. And so while we've all likely used some sort of SES, socioeconomic status, most often as an index variable comprised of different sociodemographic characteristics, and SES is an important predictor in many areas of research. Research also indicates a robust association between SSS and multiple key variables of interest. And studies have found that this association is often even more robust than between SES and variables of interest, particularly in items related to measures of health. And SSS has some distinctive advantages over SES. SES can be very difficult to harmonize, especially in cross-national contexts with variables such as education, income, which can really vary cross-nationally. SSS allows for more systematic measurement across countries and cultures. At the same time, however, SSS is often collected on this linear scale, which makes it vulnerable to survey error, such as differential use of extreme response style. And as the prior research we just discussed indicates, there may well be cross-cultural differences in ERS when looking at other variables of interest. So here's the item from the MOOC surveys that people were presented with in the online survey. So they were asked to imagine a ladder with 10 steps representing how society is set up. At the top of the ladder are people who are the best off, so on. And at the bottom of the ladder are people who are the worst off, that have the least money, little or no education, no job, and so on. So pre-May 2021, respondents were asked to continue to imagine that this rainbow ladder presents how society is set up. Please select the level of the ladder where you think you stand at this time in your life. So like I said, prior to May 2021, respondents saw this rainbow ladder. However, in May 2021, the scale was changed from this vertical ladder to this horizontal image we see in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And the wording changed as well to say, where do you think you stand at this time in your life relative to other people throughout the world? So I will note that we're planning to look at how this change in instrument design may have impacted response, both as a direct effect and as an interaction term with Hofstede's framework and their cultural dimensions. But for now, we're really looking at all the data in the aggregate from September 2020 to September 2021. And we are, for the moment, ignoring this change, although we're aware that this change may impact the results that we see. I also mentioned that we had a second item that we'd begun these preliminary analyses with, and that was an item that actually first asked respondents to rate themselves in relation to other people in their region. And so we saw some similarities in our preliminary analyses with this worldwide SSS item, but we had some serious concerns as well about the measurement error introduced just by the idea of region and the myriad ways of interpretation across local context, domestic context, regional, continental context. And we really had no idea, whether people in certain areas of the world were interpreting region the same way as people in other areas. What I know about cross-cultural research indicates that probably not. So, we really just set this aside for now and hope to be able to come back and focus on it later with some variations and changes to the questionnaire that I'll talk about at the end. So let's start to look at some distributions. So all the following univariate distributions are based on, our total sample. And although at some point this will change, and I'll talk about when we start restricting our sample. I'll remind you that this is in the context of COVID, September 20 to September 2021. And so first of all, this is the distribution of where people ranked their SSS. And, we're really when we're talking about extreme response style later on, we're really going to be focusing on extreme response style as defined by the people who said 9 and 10. They rank themselves as 9 and 10 in the scale. The literature on ERS sometimes talks about both ends of the scale, the 0, 1, or 1 and 2 versus the 9 and 10. But SSS really lends itself more to focus on the upper end. And we also just, in terms of what we actually have from our data set, we also have far fewer respondents who use the lower end. And at first we were grouping the two, but then we ended up just really focusing on the upper end. This is one area where we definitely would like feedback about, what people might think about the choice that we've made to focus on the upper end here. And I also want to note that while we don't show it here, we do actually have a significant amount of missing data. So about 38% of respondents didn't answer this question. And so in future analyses, we really plan to focus on non-response as well. But here we just remove them from the analyses. So this is, a distribution of gender. We can see that we have more males than females. We wanted to present all the categories of gender where people could self-identify here, but we do note that in the regression analyses I'll get to in a few minutes, that we only include people who self-identify as male or female for now, given the relatively small number in the other 3 categories and the fact that we don't think it's appropriate to simply combine these into like a third category. We have dropped them for now. And again, we plan to consider how we might include these in future analyses. But again, as preliminary analyses, we're really only looking at people who self-identify as male and female. Age distribution, we've grouped them into 3 separate age distributions. And as we would expect, 3/4 of our respondents come from the youngest demographic group under 35. This is as we would expect. Again, we also have more educated respondents as we would expect, with 65% and above indicating they have at least a bachelor's degree. We have more employed respondents than unemployed respondents, 55 to 45%. This is during the pandemic, so this may be a little bit different from what they normally see as MOOC students. We also, from another variable, know that about 55% of respondents self-identified as students over and above just being students to these MOOC surveys. And this is distributed both among respondents who said they were employed and respondents who said they were unemployed. We don't include this as a variable in our analyses. And something we might think about in the future, but I just want to note the relatively high number of essentially, not even full-time students, but really, dedicated students that we have in this sample. And here we have a graph showing the nationality of respondents from the 10 countries with the largest number of completed pre-course surveys. And you can see that there is, a large predominance from India and from the US, with about, 22% of completed surveys coming from Indian students and about, 20 from the US, and then it really drops off. and again, these are just the top 10 countries. We are showing this, and we talked about, how we might show the vast proportion of students from across the world. But like I said before, about 60 to 70 countries had at least several thousand students. And then, at least 150 countries had hundreds of students each. So we also want to note the importance that language can play in the cognitive response process, which is something that, we think about as survey methodologists. And we know that language does make a difference in how people respond to different items and how they use scales. And we can only investigate here how ERS might be operationalized in the English language context because students had to complete the survey in English. But we also want to recognize the variation in English language ability across our respondents and include it in our models as a control. So here we can see that the majority consider themselves fluent or highly fluent across all 4 measures of proficiency: understanding, speaking, reading, and writing. Other people report greater comfort with understanding and with reading. And so we use these data to compute an average English language proficiency score for each of the respondents to include in our models. And then, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the Individualism Collectivism Index is based on a scale from 0 to 100, with higher scores indicating greater individualism. So in the literature, there's actually no consensus on a cutoff score for categorizing a country as individualistic or collectivist, and some analyses do use a binary variable and some use the linear variable. So in our analyses for now, we wanted to use a binary variable, and we decided to use the score of 50 as a cutoff. So countries having a score of 50 or above are individualistic, countries with scores of under 50 are collectivistic. And so looking at where our respondents come from, we can see that the majority, about 60%, are from collectivist countries and about 40 are from individualistic countries. And you'll see here now that if you add up the ends, we have about 300,000 cases, down from that 400,000 that we started with. This is for a few reasons. One, like I said, we are now restricting our sample to respondents who answered that SSS question, and we do have some missing data. Hofstede's index is not available for all countries worldwide. It's only available for about 80 countries. And so, we lose countries where we don't have that data for those countries. We decided to drop all respondents from countries with 20 or fewer respondents. And as I show in a minute, we also controlled for the relative wealth of each country using GNI data. And these data were also not available for all countries, although there was significant overlap between all of these reasons why countries might have been dropped. So like I said, at the end of the day, we end up with about 300,000 respondents, still a very sizable data set. Oops. And lastly, I have to acknowledge an important aspect of our analyses, which is that we know there's an association between a country's wealth and their score on Hofstede's index, which is really relevant for us since we're asking respondents about their own financial or, overall, economic well-being, relative to other people in their country or other people in the world. So again, using our restricted sample, we want to look at a bivariate distribution of the collectivist individualistic index and the World Bank GNI classification using World Bank's definitions for middle income and high income countries for our own binary categorization. And you'll see here that there are no lower income countries, and that's because of this combination of lack of Hofstede data and removal of countries from where we had 20 or fewer respondents. Low income countries just are really not represented very well as people who are at least completing these pre-survey, pre-MOOC course surveys. And you can see that when considering wealth, close to 2/3 of our respondents, about 188,000 people, came from these high income, high GNI countries, representing both individualistic and collectivist countries. And this is in contrast to those from the middle GNI countries, the middle income countries, where almost exclusively these people are in countries that are categorized as collectivist, right? So now we turn to some models. This first model is logistic regression. This is at the individual level. It includes individualism, high GNI, an interaction term between individualism and high GNI, and in addition to controls for education, employment, age, gender, and English language proficiency. And as you can see, all these estimates are statistically significant. And as we expect, if we focus on this interaction term for individualism and GNI, we can see a significant increase in the use of ERS in high-income individualistic countries. And so while we don't show it here, we also looked at a series of stepwise models, starting with these first variables. And with the addition of each individual variable, as it was included, individualism high GNI remained significant, and the other variables of the other control variables also remain significant. And we think that each of these control variables by themselves may have explained the individualism effect. However, by including each of these variables individually and then all together, we have a higher level of confidence that we can interpret this variable as really being about culture. And so let's look at this interaction another way. Here we graph the predicted percentages of people using ERS by GNI and Hofstede scale from the model we just looked at. And essentially what we're seeing here is that we have fewer people using ERS in middle income countries in general, regardless of Hofstede's cultural categorization. And this may be because people in LMICs are reporting on their actual perceptions of their subjective social status, right? Like they're less likely to report that relative to others in the world, they're near the top, simply because they're aware of their country's own relative position in the world. But among respondents from high income countries, you see over here, there is definitely a greater likelihood of using ERS in these individualistic countries versus in the collectivist countries. So both because of the strong interaction between wealth and culture, as well as the small number of respondents from middle income individualistic countries, we then ran another set of analyses restricting the sample to high income countries only, which allowed us to remove both GNI and the interaction term. So again, we ran a series of stepwise models with the addition of each variable. And with the addition of each variable, the effect of individualism on ERS remains strong and significant, although I'm only showing you the full model here. This started high, it got slightly lower with the addition of each control variable, but it still remained quite high and very significant. And again, when we look at the graph of the predicted and actual percentage of using ERS, again, based on the model, we really see a sizable difference in the actual values between respondents from collectivist and individual societies. And this is represented by the yellow line here. And a smaller but detectable difference in the predicted values, represented by the blue line, due to all the controls in the model. So again, really giving us some evidence here that what we're seeing, these differences between people in their use of 9 to 10 on the scale, really seems to be driven more by culture rather than any other individual characteristic. So lastly, if we zoom out a bit and look at the macro level data for high income countries, where each circle in this figure represents an individual country, we again see this very strong relationship between the proportion of a country's respondents using ERS and the country's individualistic collectivist score, where we're using the linear variable. And we see really a strong and significant correlation coefficient of 0.74 here. So to summarize, what we're seeing in middle income countries is evidence that indicates that measures of SSS may actually not be subject to ERS resulting from cultural differences. Although we know that this is really hard to determine with a high degree of confidence, given the very small number of respondents from middle income individualistic countries. However, when we focus in on the high income countries, we do see some compelling evidence to us anyway, that SSS is subject to differential ERS, depending on whether respondents are in an individualistic or collectivist country. And again, we see this both at the micro and macro levels. And this evidence reinforces for us the idea that there may well be the significant cultural difference in the way respondents are using scales. And this is in line with what smaller studies have also seen. And this matters because, as I mentioned early on, subjective socioeconomic status has been found to be a robust variable in predictive models. And it has value in 3MC research as well, in contrast to the more often used SCS variable, which requires harmonization. However, cross-cultural analyses using 3MC data may inadvertently introduce error if indeed respondents in individualistic countries are vulnerable to extreme response styles differentially from respondents in collectivist countries. So we are well aware that we're facing a number of limitations and challenges in this work. First, we're using Hofstede's cultural frameworks, at least for now, and Hofstede's cultural frameworks have been subject to criticism over the years by a number of people. Researchers have found conflicting findings with other studies. Hofstede's been criticized for providing few theoretical arguments in much of his original work. There's been a number of criticisms of his nomenclature, especially of his nomenclature surrounding the idea of collectivism. There's been criticisms of his narrow scopes of measures. His original samples were based on primarily elites, and his variables aren't available for all countries, which for us really raises issues nowadays of equity and analyses that we face using His indices. And the MOOC data that we're using, well, it's really great. It also has a number of limitations as well. First of all, we may be subject to some of the same criticism levied at Hofstede. Our sample has limitations. It's more heavily young. It's an more educated population with access to the internet. At this point, we're basing our preliminary conclusions only on one measure at this, right now. We don't have other benchmarks. So other studies of ERS often use measures in both scales and other formats, such as Likert, to really compare if what they're seeing is an example or indicative of ERS, but we only have SSS on its own, although we can control for education at the individual level. Of course, these are not probability samples. They're, samples of convenience, although we do believe that based on the analysis that we've done, it does allow us to look at some of these methodological effects. Our sample is overrepresented, particularly by respondents from the US and India. And we're really interested in hearing about ways in which people think that we might be able to deal with this imbalance. And then lastly, a significant limitation as I see it is that the study or the survey was done in English. So it's definitely could be prone to differential native language effects, based on what we know about the cognitive response process and how that operates differentially across different languages. So given those limitations, we also have a number of exciting future directions we'd like to work on in the coming months and the coming year. First of all, as I mentioned before, we have a relatively large amount of non-response analysis. And so we're interested in looking at that and, what differences we might see by culture. Are people in some, individualistic cultures more or less prone to non-response than people in collectivist cultures? And, how does that vary even within individualistic versus collectivist societies? We're interested in analyses to account for this unequal representation from different countries. We're interested in differences, really narrowing in on different groups of people. For example, among high-income individualist countries, are there differences just between those? Does the US really stick out compared to Germany and other high-income individualistic countries? And, that's true as well, in high-income collectivist countries and so forth, in those different cells. We really want to do more analyses. We want to look at other cultural dimensions. So we really only focus on one dimension of Hofstede. Clearly, there are many, Hofstede himself has many others, 5 others that we haven't looked at all. We haven't looked at, other researchers' cultural dimensions that I, talked about early on. Some of these may be good candidates for looking at extreme response style. We also have a number of other variables available to us in this data set that we are interested in that, might have other methodological, areas where we can look for, survey error. We're interested in the direction of the scale and the change from lateral to horizontal and whether this might have differential impact by cultural frameworks. And then we also want to explore possibly if it's, possible to work with Centers for Academic Innovation on, changes or additions we might be able to make in future pre-course surveys that people do. For example, maybe adding probes to understand what people are thinking about region and how that, might be different across different areas of the world, and how we might be able to retrospectively even, apply what we learn to this region question of SSS and, do some additional analyses. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and open the floor for discussion and questions. And we really, again, appreciate any feedback that you have on this very, very preliminary research. You are the first group of people we've shared this with, and we're excited to hear any thoughts that you might have. And thanks so much.
Great, thanks for sharing that. And we're happy to be the first audience that you have for this study. Really relevant to LAPOP and our audience. We've been thinking about issues with extreme scales, especially with our switch to telephone surveys this year. So it's really relevant for us. If anybody has any questions, you can put them in the chat or use the raise hand feature. Julie, would you mind stopping the screen share just so I can see?
Happy to stop. Yep. Oops.
We could always go back to it if people have questions about that.
Okay.
just on that last screen, I'll kick it off. I was also wondering if, in the litany of follow-up analysis and things to consider, if you thought about like course effects. So are these people coming from computer science MOOCs or art history or survey science? Because that could affect how people understand scales, and it could complicate the relationship between where they're coming from and their use of the ERS.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm looking at Kate, who's nodding her head. I do believe what you want to say something about the data that we have that might speak to that?
Yeah, so we can connect it to courses. We haven't done that yet. That's a great additional analysis for us to look at. It is a skewed sample. Michigan's MOOC portfolio is very strong in the introductory programming and data science spaces. And so if we were to look at the distribution of course enrollments, it would definitely be skewed in that lens. But there's a diversity of, we've got a nice array of things in the portfolio broadly. So we definitely could investigate deeper per domain.
And that's a great point. I just made a note of that. I see a comment in the chat about the classification of India, whether it was high income or middle income. And I am going to look to Michelle and Junhui on that, because they were responsible for doing the actual hard work of running the analyses, and they're a little bit closer to the data than I am.
Yeah, so like I do not quite remember how India, like whether India was characterized into middle or high income countries, but the process we did was using the World Bank data, and basically we categorized the middle income country and high income country based on the criteria provided by the World Bank, and we set that as a threshold, and as long as it is greater than that threshold, it will be categorized into high, and as long as it is lower than that threshold, it will be categorized into middle countries.
Hi everyone. I remember India is a middle income country in our study. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Junhui. That's helpful to know too. So yeah, so I guess what we're seeing when we're thinking about any imbalance that we're seeing in the high income countries, that's going to really be driven by the US. But in the middle income countries, it'll be driven by India. So no, thanks.
Stacy Frank, you have your hand raised, go ahead.
Sure, thanks for the presentation. It was really interesting. I lost the thread of what you were saying about the different ways that the scale was asked about in terms of the ladder versus the horizontal scale. So it would be helpful if you could remind me of how you integrated those data, or if you just used one or the other. And I'm also wondering, given the very distinct rainbow coloring behind the ladder, have you thought about integrating any analyses about whether people associate that image with LGBTQ rights, or put it through that lens, and then comparing, more affirming countries with less affirming countries, and see if that made a difference in how people use that scale?
Yeah, that's a really good point. The first is that the scale changed from vertical to horizontal partway through the data that we're using. And for right now, we elected to ignore that change. We know it's there. We initially thought about trying to integrate it up front, and then we realized that we really need to get our heads around what we were seeing, just first generally what we were seeing in terms of individual collectivism. We were going to come back to that. So for now, we're ignoring that change. We're just assuming that everybody had the same scale, which, as a survey methodologist, I'm well aware of the downfalls of that. But yeah, that's what we're doing so far. That's a really good point about, whether there is a lens in which people from certain countries or certain cultures might see that. I know I hadn't seen the picture myself for a while until I was putting these slides together, and was struck by that as well. Kate, I don't know if this is something that you've, CAI have thought about.
I hadn't, amusingly, when I pulled the image for you to use in the presentation, I was like,
Uh-huh.
oh yeah, I had forgotten it was truly rainbow. So I think that's a great thing for us to go back and consider. I will say that the reason for the change was for accessibility purposes. We've gotten notes over the years that visually impaired learners were not able to engage in the scale. And so we wanted to address that. And so that was the source of the change.
I don't think that we have any questions in the survey that I know there's no attitude questions in there about, rights.
There is not. And I'd want to think about this. This is done in the context of understanding our learners, right? And so if we were to add a question, and which I most definitely, I love the collaboration with this team as helping me think about how to ask questions better and iterate this and use this to serve research very broadly. But I'd really want to think about how we're framing it to them, that's an appropriate thing for us to be asking them about.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Well, and especially since, we don't even use this anymore. It's just thinking back to what data are available. I don't think there's certainly no existing survey data that we have in this data set that would let us look at that. It would have to be, something at the macro level, maybe about, countries, laws, and rights and that sort of thing. But it's certainly something that we could think about. It's so difficult because I can imagine that ends up with some of what we've already done too, but that's okay. That's something that we should be thinking about it.
I was just wondering if you have any background on why that original image was used, because it's a very distinctive image. And we know that any visual input we give the respondent, they're going to respond to. And it could be an interesting area of research, because the question is not itself related to that, but if people are perceiving it through that lens, I don't know how it could impact their responses.
Yeah, I was not the person who designed the original survey, so I can't speak to why they selected that version of the image. To my understanding, it was what they had found as the best way to go about asking a global audience about socioeconomic status. Based on historical conversations, I would not have assumed that they chose that versus a black and white image. I would guess that they thought that was the image that was standard practice.
It's interesting because it really jumps out as maybe a loaded image.
And I think it's probably loaded now in a way that it wasn't 10, 15, 20 years ago.
That's true. That's very true. I'm just having a look in the chat. There's a question in here about the question in India. Was our conclusion that ERS is more apparent in high income countries than in middle income countries? I would say yes, that's true. That was our conclusion for now, with the caveat that, like I said, in our categorization scheme, the way we categorize collectivist and individualistic countries, we had very, very few we had very, very few middle income individualistic countries. But one thing that we haven't done, so one of the very final figures that I showed was that scatter plot at the macro level of ERS among high income countries. Certainly we could do that among low income or middle income countries and have a look at, just among the middle income countries, still, there's still a range from, countries like Ecuador and Guatemala that were, down with, ranges of individuals and collectivism of 6 to 8 versus countries that were closer to 50. And we could see if there's still, a linear association that holds there.
And one comment from Tim Johnson. I'll just read it for the sake of the chat. And if you have any follow-up on that, great presentation, a nice contribution. It will be interesting to see how extreme responding is associated with Hofstede's uncertainty avoidance dimension, with the expectation that high UA will be associated with more extreme responding.
Thank you, Tim. That is definitely on our list of things to do. And one of the things that we hope to turn to next, like I said, it's exciting to be able to have a large data set to look at, so many different cultural dimensions. Yeah, we had talked a little bit about that. We just ran out of time ahead of this talk. But we're giving a shortened version of this at APOR, so perhaps we'll be able to include some of these things in the next month or so, or 3 weeks. So no, thank you very much. I'm happy you can be here today. There was also a message about the administration of this. It was indeed a self-administered survey. There were no interviewers. These were people who were sitting at home, logging into these online MOOCs. And Kate, please, can you confirm? I don't know. Are these paid for, or are these for fee, or are these free, or is it a mix?
It's a mix. So the
a mix,
survey
okay.
is not gated. So it would be accessible to all learners, whether or not they have paid. And then we have data about learners who have made that choice. So we would actually be able to analyze the data through that lens if that were of interest.
Actually, and that might be of interest too, because that might be another indicator of the relative economic situation, whether they paid for the course or not.
Yep.
But good question. So
one
question.
comment from Georgina Pizzolito. What I like about the latter is that it gives the idea of being up and down, maybe comparing responses to the scale in a horizontal or vertical position matters.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think you mentioned possibly looking at that in the future.
Yeah, definitely. There's a question from Kate. Did we include any traps in the survey? And if so, do you have any idea of how many people failed them? I'm not entirely sure what you mean by traps, but Kate's shaking her head.
I'm assuming those are reverse coded items or things that would try to get at whether or not somebody's paying attention, or we don't
Or
currently
acquiescing
have
or
any of
something.
those. Although I think that the questions change format and function throughout the we've tried to keep it very short survey. So that would be a really interesting thing to go back and try to get a sense of how actively engaged people have been.
Yeah. And remind me, Kate, I don't know, do we have timestamp data for these?
We most definitely have timestamp data.
So
And
that would also
browser
be an indication of how engaged people might be.
Yep.
Randall Reese, do you want to ask a question?
Sorry, yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, it's probably easier to just ask, I thought, rather than keep typing in the chat. But
Oh, please.
so I'm following up on the India question. So I just want to confirm, you classified India then, based on what you said, as a middle income collectivist society?
That sounds right.
That sounds right. Okay. I'm confirming you, and you found extreme response file to be less present in those countries. So it would be less present in India.
Correct.
All right.
Correct.
The confound for me there is I work at IBM doing employee research, and for people that are aware, Hofstede's subjects were IBM employees. And I do employee research on a regular basis where I find the most extreme response style I've ever seen, and it's continually confirmed, is in India.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Right. And so I understand the points about a lot of the criticism of Hofstede's work, and yeah, his subjects, because they're IBM employees by nature, probably would be elitist, if you want to describe them that way. They definitely were more educated in the regular population, probably had higher incomes and so forth. But his findings still holds continually for me.
They do, absolutely. Yeah. No, that's really interesting. I'm glad you brought that up about India. And like I said, we have not looked hard at all about, relative differences between countries in these smaller groups. Except the last figure I ran, and that was really just that was combining both individuals and collectivist countries. But it would be interesting to look among middle income countries to see how India looks compared to other low or to other middle income collectivist countries. So I'm glad you pointed that out, because we'll definitely have a look at that to see if that, India looks different.
Yeah. And in the sense of all the data I have, India always looks different. And I always have to be aware of that when I'm reporting any results, because I know respondents in India are always going to select the top end of the scale. The other extreme I always see confirmed in the results is I know Japanese respondents are always going to be modest. Now, Japan, as to I understand it, I have to revisit Hofstede work, is also a collectivist society.
Yeah.
But you see the opposite behavior there. And so there's more than just collectivism and individualism going on in order to understand these results. Because in Japan, I can look at a response in my data, and I can tell you immediately, doing cross-culture, who's going to be the top scoring country. I know it will always be India, and I know Japan will always be lowest or among the lowest. I don't even need to see what the question is to know that.
Do you have any thoughts about why India?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I have a question about your question. When you talk about the extreme responses from India, do you mean that some extreme responses or the overall proportion of extreme responses? I think that's a point. Maybe some people in India are very extreme, but others are mild.
Right, it could be, and again, I would say my data is only on IBM employees, so they would probably be, relative to the rest of the population, would be higher income compared to the rest of India and more educated. So that's a bias that's probably inherent in the data I have. Same would be true of probably Japanese employees in other countries too. So those bias would be present in both countries in the data I have.
And certainly, I think, to some extent of the data that we have as well, which is helpful.
Right.
Comparison point,
Right,
actually,
right.
very
This is
happy,
really
at least
interesting, but it's
it
but-
has some of the same sort of challenges in terms of representation.
Right. And it's inherent in so many of the research we do. We can't always get at everything that's going on. Obviously.
Yeah, definitely. No, thanks for that.
I had one clarification question about why you made the collectivist individualistic variable binary. I think I missed that in the presentation. And if you tried doing the same analysis with the continuous
With
format.
a linear variable. My co-authors, do you remember if we've done these analyses? Did we jump right to including it as a binary variable? I think we did, because I think we were initially thinking in terms of binary, or in terms of bivariate distributions. But anyone correct me if I'm wrong.
That's my
At this
memory as well.
Yeah, I think you are correct.
I think I have something to say about this problem. I think we have the dimension data, which is IDV, which is a continuous variable, but we want to explore the collectivism and individualism. So we use 49 as the point to tell the difference between this. And when we classify the countries by this standard, and we Google about whether they are individual country and collectivist country, we realize that they are correct. I mean they're the same as what we found in this data.
No, thanks, Junhui. I do think it is something we should consider doing. Certainly when I was looking at this macro level analyses at the country level, I wanted to use the linear variable, and it was a very nice way of looking at how it related in a linear fashion to ERS. And so I do think it will be worth exploring, even if only for a sensitivity analysis. Perhaps we'll only present binary, but it would be good to see that it held up in general. And in some ways, it does get around a little bit the fact that it could be a criticism that it's a little bit arbitrary to pick 50. And I also don't know what the distribution of the IC scale looks like. It may not be normal. So, but no, it's a good point. It's definitely on our long list of things to follow up on. I see we're over time.
Yeah, we can wrap up there. So thank you to all the presenters for sharing this research. I'm excited to see where it goes, and I look forward to seeing it published in a very top journal. So yeah, thanks to everybody for coming. This is our last with some of the semester. Look out for next semester. we'll have talks in the future.
Right.
Any
Thanks so much
parting
for the great
words?
series. No, thank you so much
Yeah.
for a great series and for inviting us and, bearing with us as we worked through our kinks in this first presentation. So we really appreciate it. And it's nice to see some familiar faces out there. So hope to see some of you in person soon. Thank you.
Yeah, we're happy to have you.
Yeah. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Have a great day. Bye.